I mean, I think one of the things that I always try and get people to remember is that the population of Gaza is more than half children. More than 50% of the population is under 17. So any of these kids that are 8 or over have already lived through 3 attacks, the type you've just seen. And the last attack was even bigger than the one in Coyle. And like for a short while under Morsi, there was some things getting in through the tunnels, there was more things getting in. But since Sisi took back control in Egypt, the tunnels have all been completely sealed again. So Gaza again is completely sealed off. They talk about what's allowed, the banned list of items going into Gaza, but in reality it's an allowed list, and only things that are individually itemised on that list are allowed in. So for instance, you can allow tomatoes in because they're on the list. Peaches aren't, so peaches are banned, they're dangerous. When I went in, I was on a boat that went in 2008, and we were the first boat that had been into Gaza since 1967. And we were breaking the siege. And some of the things we took in at that time was paper for kids drawing on, drawing materials, basic things like that. Because all of these things are banned by the Israelis. Apparently they're a terrible threat to the Israeli state. So, since that massive attack of last month, there is no facility for the Palestinians to get the building materials they need in. So everything that's been destroyed, it's going to be virtually impossible for them to rebuild. And they will do. You see them with hammers chipping away at the bits of cement, separating out the metal that's been used in the construction from the cement, and recycling things, and they can rebuild a certain amount that way. But their situation at the moment is absolutely horrendous. Their medical supplies, at the maximum, they'll never have 3 days worth of supplies there. So if there's an attack like this, they run out of medical supplies almost instantly, which means that all these horrendous injuries are being treated. People don't even have basic painkillers. The rehabilitation facilities in Gaza, there was only one rehabilitation hospital. That was Al-Wafa Hospital, which the Israelis destroyed. The situation of the people in Gaza is just beyond anything that we can imagine coming from here. One of the things that Frida, who made the film, one thing that she really insisted on when she was showing it is that she doesn't want people to come away from here with hatred. She doesn't want people to watch this film and feel hatred for the Israelis or the Jews or anything like that. She says she's had so much help from Jewish people who are involved in the campaign for trying to bring an end to this injustice. And she's worked with Israeli people who are also involved, the Israeli anarchists and things, will go into the West Bank, who go in and try and help. What she wants is people to be motivated to try and do something politically, to understand that the political system has to be changed, that there has to be pressure to encourage the boycott, because the boycott of Israel, the Israeli goods, is a very, very important campaign. It's one of the main non-violent campaigns, the main non-violent weapon that they have available to them. So has anybody got any questions that they'd like to ask that going to the film?
Has that film been made generally available through the internet, or I presume it wouldn't get shown on television anywhere?
Not yet. It's only very recently been finished. At the moment, she was here in Scotland a couple of months ago. She was touring and showing it, but it's not in wider release yet. Hopefully, it will be soon. But, I mean, what the situation on the fishing boats that she filmed, the situation with the farmers. I mean, I can say from personal experience, I was never on a fishing boat that wasn't attacked. I had one day which was a particularly quiet day, with being the captain of the boat that I was on. He had his three young sons were his crew, along with one of their friends and one of his friends. So he was very, very careful. He never went more than 2 miles offshore. We could clear sight of the shore all day. And it was a very quiet day for the most part, but we still had 2 periods of 20 minutes worth of gunfire, with the gunboats circling the boat, firing almost constantly around the boat and throwing explosives into the nets at the back. The Israelis tend to come into the boats when they're drawing their nets in. They'll allow the boats to sail, to let the nets out. As soon as they begin to try and bring the nets in, that's when the Israelis try and come round, and they're really trying to hit the machinery, trying to hit the nets, trying to hit the cables, trying to prevent them from getting what small catch they can in. The fishermen, the ceasefire agreement this time round says that they'll be allowed to go out to the 12 miles. But so far the reports we're getting is that the boats are still being fired on well inside that 12-mile limit. And the farming Gaza, which you saw there, again has been utterly devastated in that last attack. And you know, the farmers we were working with when we were there, I've not been able to contact anybody. I don't know that I know there was an awful lot of death in Gaza. It was cut off for more than a week, for nobody was able to access it. Hopefully at the end of the month I'll be able to find out actually if anybody survived. But one of the things in this most recent attack, the resistance were more organised. I think the Israelis got a bit of a shock. In the 2009 attack, within 3 days they'd completely cut Gaza in half. And they were doing whatever they wanted there with virtually no resistance whatsoever, because it's impossible. It's virtually impossible to resist the absolute massive inequity of firepower. But in this last attack, they actually never managed to get more than 3 miles from the Israeli. They never managed to actually cut Gaza in half in the same way. And I'm hoping the fact that they've realised that actually the Palestinians have now developed some resistance for when they come over, when they actually invade. Some tactics which are actually a bit more effective against them. I'm hoping that the Israelis will now begin to actually consider talking more, maybe give them a bit of a shock this time. It's sorry.
Was quite phosphorus used this time?
I don't know.
I don't remember any report of it when I was watching.
Yeah, I think one of the major differences this time was that there was international news crews actually in Gaza the whole time. In 2009, Israel kept the border sealed and Egypt kept the border sealed, so there weren't any news crews from outside actually on the ground. I think it did make a difference this time. You know, not much, but you know, they were still using flechettes missiles, which is the the bombs, which basically burst open and release hundreds of very small kind of darts that just rip through whatever's in its way. They were still using them, but I don't think they used white phosphorus this time.
Thank you. What's the UN's position in this just now? Because I noticed about 2 weeks ago they said that Israel is guilty of committing war crimes, but it's been hushed up since then.
Yeah, well, I mean, sadly without American backing, the UN are pretty toothless, yeah. I know that this time the Gazans, the Palestinians, are actually going to be presenting a case to the International Criminal Court, which is something that they've never done before. They're now in a position to do that, and I know that the Palestinians are actually going to be going to the court this time and trying to get something done that way. I know that, you know, the UN organisations, UNRWA and OCHA and things, they were calling on the ICC to step in. So again, hopefully this time round, that's a path it'll go, yeah.
What kind of international support does Gaza have at the moment? I mean, in the UN or somewhere else?
I mean, the UN are in there all the time. I think most of the government positions are that they won't speak with Hamas directly, and Hamas are the government in Gaza. So, like last time I was there are small groups of like European politicians that go in fact-finding missions. There's growing sort of from grassroots and from we've got a lot of support actually in the Scottish Parliament for Palestinian sort of cause. But on an official level, they're still refusing to speak with Hamas. I think the unity government that the Palestinians just recently formed is going to be very, very important. What's her name? Hanan Ashwari, who's been their main spokesperson. The new president and the new spokesperson, the people who they're not from Fatah, they're not from Hamas. They were involved in the grassroots First Intifada, the leadership, the civil leadership of that. And at the moment that seems to be holding very well together, and they seem to be able to, you know, be keeping Fatah and Hamas together, working together. And they were, for the first time, they stood behind Hamas during this last invasion. In previous invasions, it's been Mahmoud Abbas who's been a spokesperson, and he's been condemning, he's not spoken up on behalf of the Gazans. But this time there was strong support from the West Bank. And I think that the Western governments, outside governments, can deal with the unity government in a way that they couldn't deal with Hamas government. You know, they should be able to deal with Hamas government because they were the elected government. Personally, I'm not a Hamas supporter, I'm not a Fatah supporter. You know, that's for the Palestinians to decide. But I'm hoping that with this new unity government, we'll be able to deal with the government level on the outside.
Simon?
One of the things that really strikes you when watching that film is that the state of Israel has absolutely no fear whatsoever. It feels itself able to, with complete impunity, to do what it likes in relation to the Palestinian territories, to the extent that, you know, fishermen like that are harassed continually, incessantly harassed with gunfire and explosive devices going off, and it's all calculated to, you know, to completely undermine, destroy just about every single institution which in any country makes life possible, whether it's commerce, commercial activity at however low a level, whether it's a health service, whether it's the education system. But the state of Israel clearly feels itself to be, irrespective of one or two kind of minor developments one way or the other, it feels itself to be completely invulnerable. And clearly, you know, a judgment was made a very, very long time ago by the people whose job it is in the state, the Israeli state apparatus, to make such judgments that they could, for as long as they were getting the support from the major centres of imperialism, whether it's the United States and indeed to other imperialist countries, but also on the back of a huge degree of cynicism in various parts of the Arab world, you know, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Egypt, and so on and so forth. But I wonder, could you maybe just say something about the way in which, in the face of unbelievable levels of destruction, I actually found that an immensely difficult film to watch. There were bits of it I couldn't watch. Actually, it was just horror piled on horror. But somehow Palestinian society seems to be able to keep going. The political process in Palestine seems to be able to keep going. Despite the appearance of apparently blanket bombing, random bombing, clearly the Israeli military is targeting things like the health service and the education system. Could you actually maybe say something about how the Palestinian authorities there are actually able to maintain, at however rudimentary a level, a health service, and particularly because I teach for a living myself, I was really interested to see the little girl coming back in a school uniform and everything at the end of a couple of hours in school. Could you say how the education system is maintained as well?
Yeah, well, for a lot of the education system, they rely on the UN. And there's umpteen UN schools in Gaza, and they managed to get some sort of equipment in for the schools, but it has to be a shift system. There's nothing like enough places for all of the kids. So you get the younger kids start at 6 o'clock in the morning, go until about 11 o'clock. Then they leave, and the older kids all go in, and you've got different days when you get different people there. I mean, it's very much an Israeli tactic to take out the centres of government. I mean, in the West Bank in 2001, one of their main targets were all the land registries. You know, all the places that held the documents for people's land ownership, which is fairly important in the places where. But all of the government offices, you know, and the welfare offices, all of these places, they get regularly bombed. But I mean, I think partly that's how the mosques have become so important as centres, because the mosques also hold records. The mosques also, you know, are centres of community, and so they can help people. You know, the government can channel help through the mosques, which actually help to get the information back into where it's needed. But it's very much, I mean, one thing the Palestinians aren't short of is people to go out and do the information gathering, get the information back, and they're motivated. And it's one of the freedoms that Palestinians have, that the only freedom that Palestinians have that Israelis don't, is the freedom not to join the military. And the vast majority of the Palestinians, when they leave school, they try and become journalists, doctors, you know, they try and get jobs, you know, whether it's going out gathering information that's necessary to put the welfare office back together, the education department back together. They volunteer doing these things. You know, they kind of just get together in committees, work everything out at a local level and pass that information up. It's amazing actually to see. You know, you can't imagine the same sort of community involvement coming together so easily here.
So I'm particularly interested in the kind of level of psychological services support and everything, because I mean, one of the most kind of fundamental things, you said that half the population of Gaza is made up of children. Well, I suppose one of the most obvious relationships that's impacted by this sort of state terrorism is the sort of relationship between parents and children, and the cumulative impact of that kind of degree of insecurity on the part of kids when kids, who should be able to rely on your parents to look after you and to protect you, and when great swathes of the population, and half the population of Gaza, suddenly realises that their parents, if they're lucky enough to have parents who are still alive and who are still in a position to look after them to some extent, can't actually do so and can't actually keep their children out of harm's way. The cumulative impact on the kind of psychological insecurity must be absolutely, well, I can't even begin to imagine what that must be like. I mean,
Yeah.
is there a particular input on the part of psychological services and everything too?
There's very, very little psychological services provision. I know a couple of, there's a few small organisations that are trying to work, but they're really in the drop in the ocean to what's needed. But yeah, you're right. The psychological impact of knowing your parents can't protect you. On the West Bank, it's something kids watching over and over again, their parents being humiliated in checkpoints and things and being able to do nothing. And it very much contributes to the radicalisation in certain areas. And you can see why people begin to get so caught up in their religion, because what else is there but God? You know, there's nothing, there's nobody coming to help you, your parents can't protect you. You know, it brings about much more of a belief in God and whatever He can give you.
I'm just to ask a general question, how do you feel about this? Do you think that the latest incursion or attack on Gaza has had any bearing on the right-wing extremism that's been taking place in France in particular just now? An awful lot of anti-Semitic feeling just now. There's dogging of doors, etc., starting again, and harassments in the streets. Do you think that because of that, that has given a facility for these people to come out of the woodwork, what they're doing?
Yeah, I think that's part of it, definitely. I mean, every time the Israelis attack the West Bank or attack Gaza, there apparently is a rise in anti-Semitic feeling. I mean, like, if you're actually active in the pro-Palestine movements, then you know very well that there's a very large number of Jewish people involved in that, because they're disgusted at what's being done in their name. So you know that there's a very deep divide between Judaism and Zionism.
That's right.
That Zionism is not representative of Jewish belief. But sadly, the Israeli state constantly repeat that they are the representatives of the Jewish community, and that does sink in to a certain extent amongst people who don't necessarily go more deeply into it. So it does affect. I mean, it's something in Britain. I think all of the demonstrations have been very careful to try and get the message over. It's nothing to do with Judaism, it's Zionism, it's a political entity we're against. But I mean, I have to say, if you're on the receiving end of the Israeli soldiers, I've been sort of under arrest with Arabs and Lebanese and Palestinians and things. The constant taunt from the Israeli soldiers, the Israeli soldiers never use the word Israeli. They always refer to themselves as we're the Jewish power, we're the Jewish country, and in Israel itself, that's the representation they make, which is where the lines get blurred. But I know that the Jewish communities here hate that, because obviously they're very, very strong that this is not about religion, it's about Zionism, it's about the political Zionism.
Okay.
Probably need to watch your time, comrades.
Yeah, so
I've got a question for Rob, that'll probably need to be the last one.
Okay, just really follow on for what Hugh was asking, is there any kind of a significant organised resistance come from Israel in support of Palestine?
There's some. You've got the Israeli the anarchists. You've got groups of anarchists that go into the West Bank and do support. You've got the Breaking the Silence, which is the soldiers' organisation, where they actually talked about what they did, what they saw during Cast Lead, and since then. Well, I think that the biggest, from speaking with Israelis, after Rabin was assassinated, after taking before that assassination, there was a much bigger active and vocal support for just peace, for stopping the violence against the Palestinians, for reining in the right wing. After Rabin was assassinated, the left became very frightened of their own radicals and their own right wing, because it became very clear that to the far right in Israel, anybody speaking out against Eretz Israel, what the far right are doing, would be seen as a traitor and therefore as a valid target for the far right. So that has very much inhibited the left wing. But there's a core of very, very brave, very hard-working Israelis that try their best, try their very best.
Okay, I'd like to thank Theresa coming through and showing the film and the contribution.
Very welcome.
We sure appreciate it.